both watched at least part of it again. What sort of things were summed up for both of you about the experience of making this movie?
Well, it was sure hot there.
118 apparently.
At that time, we were already into the summer, I think, in Hyderabad. It must have been summer, in February and March. And but no, I mean that isn't really what mainly comes to mind. I think the interesting thing for me was the fact that there were two completely separate casts. And first we did the 1923 section, and with one cast, Shashi Kapoor and Greta and all, and then no, hold on, it was the other way around.
You shot contemporary.
Yeah, we started with. That's right. It was the other way around. And Julie Christie, when the new cast arrived, we had a party, and the old cast was saying that Julie Christie said she felt like a fallen leaf. She was ready to go, and but she came back later to do the Kashmiri part.
Yeah. Zakir, we need your mic. Thank you. Yeah.
Do I?
No. He's on the hand mic and we're on our. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So Zakir, what do you remember of those of that time?
I remember Jim and Ismail coming to my home. I think a few days before we were about to shoot, and said, "Okay, you're going to play Indralal." And
this was a few days before shooting?
Yeah, just about. I've never acted before in the movie or anywhere else. Just hammed it up on the stage as a musician. So.
How would you like to play Julie Christie's lover for your first acting assignment?
Oh my God! It was. I mean, you know, in India we are so respectful of great performers and gurus and so on and on. So for me, in the beginning, it was more about her being one of the great ustads of acting, and when I first met her, it was in that kind of reverence and respect, and it was. I mean, I had no clue how to act with her. I'd never acted with anybody, and to be able to do scenes with her was very difficult. But I thought if James and Isma were crazy enough to get me, I'll be crazy enough to do it.
James, was your strategy not to tell him until 2 days before so I didn't have time to worry about it?
Well, I didn't really worry too much about it because I figured he's been in front, he wasn't going to, he should not sort of freeze up in front of the camera or anything because he spends his whole life in front of audiences. And so you...
Yes, and I was gently guided by James, and I felt totally comfortable actually because I mean whatever nervousness I had, there was some gentle suggestions, do this or do that. But for me it was, I mean what I remember is that a start of a whole new chapter in my life as an artist. It just opened up a whole different venue and a whole different avenue of being able to look at my world, music, through a different light. And I have to say that, like so many other performers, actors, musicians, and that Ivory and Merchant have put in the hot seat and have helped them into a whole different just the next step into their career. I happen to be one of them, and so it was. What I remember from that is that's where my life as an entertainer really began.
Mm-hmm. I didn't read the credits closely enough. Were you involved also in the music for this film as well?
Yes. I was two of the greatest musicians of India, Pandit Hari Prasad Chaurasia and Ustad Sultan Khan, who they were both part of this film. I remember arriving in London at the Wembley Studios, and that's where we recorded the last title track. with Richard Robbins, and so there were some parts as far as the Indian element of the music was concerned, where I made some suggestions and stuff, and so Richard would come up with some form that he had in mind, and then I would just sort of fill it in with whatever the Indian counterpart melodies would be to that, and so that's how some of the Indian element arrived into the score, and so the three of us played in the score. It was not a hell of a lot of musicians, but the score sounds pretty grand. It almost sounds like it's a full orchestra.
Well, music is always an important element of Merchant Ivory films, but it seems particularly so here. I mean, the music is really, it's not about underscoring and mood setting, it's about that too, but the music is really very instrumental to the story. I mean, that wonderful scene early on in the film when the entertainment is happening and the men are all trooped off to hear it, and Olivia is drawn to it, unlike the other. I mean, it really becomes a kind of a hinge in many ways. I wonder if you would talk about how you thought about music, that and the Schumann and the way that is used in the film as well.
Well, when you have a composer, very often when there's this kind of music, it has to be it's part of the story. Normally the composer...
Yeah, is the mic...
What's going on here?
Your mic doesn't seem to be... Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
When you have to add source music to a film score, usually the composer has some ideas about what he wants, and he prefers this to that, and so on. And if it's a piano piece, Richard Robbins was a pianist, but we had to have a piece of music that Greta could convincingly play, since she wasn't a pianist, and that determined the choice of music. And for the entertainment, well, we weren't blessed with a great assortment of Indian musicians, I think, at that entertainment in the Palace.
For that Palace scene,
you
got
were not happy, I think, with the singer, as I remember.
Yeah, we got the singer from Hyderabad.
Yeah.
The film was shot in Hyderabad, that whole section, the Palace stuff. And so one of the somewhat performer of Indian music was gotten to perform live. And that's also interesting, because that scene, the performance that you hear on the screen, is actually live. And so you didn't pull in the artist to come into the studio and then dub or something.
Dub it or anything like that.
It's live, so it's very true to what the Indian music system is.
But if I'd only known at the time that he wasn't really quite up to the... no. I turned it off.
Well, we know someone didn't silence their cell phone.
Sorry.
That might have not been good for the scene.
They didn't exist back then.
But I remember that he wasn't really up to the mark, and then later on, once I found that out, I thought, well, too bad that Harry, when he comes back to get to tell Olivia that the Nawab has asked for her and all this, and he didn't say something about, when he was talking about the music, that he didn't say something like, well, he's not in good voice tonight, or some sort of thing like that. But it was too late. We couldn't manage that. It had been shot. Yeah. But music has always been certainly a big part of my films, and I've been very lucky with the composers that I've had, really, right from the beginning, and starting with people like Satyajit Ray. Who was involved in my first two features. I mean, in The Householder and then Shakespeare-Walla. And he composed the music of Shakespeare-Walla. And all along after that, I really was lucky with having very good composers.
Yeah, I mean, people associate your films with so many things, certainly the Indian films, but also the many adaptations of Forster and Mr. and Mrs. Bridge and all these other things. But your career really began with these Indian films back in the early 60s, is that?
50s even.
In the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, well, it started with a film I made about Venice, and that music was very important in that film as well.
That was actually, was that a film that you had done at USC when you were
Yeah.
a student? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but you started working, The Householder was your first
It was my first feature.
done
Yeah.
shot in India in 61?
62 we started
62,
shooting,
yeah, something like that. Let's talk a little bit more about the casting of this. We've heard about how Zakir was was thrown into the breach. Some of your other casting of this was somewhat, Julie Christie, for example, I believe she was mulling another offer at that point, wasn't she? Hadn't she been offered the verdict?
She'd been asked to do the verdict, and she wanted to do it, but she wanted to go to India more.
She's actually born in India, is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted to go to India more, so she decided to make our film. But it was, as far as Greta was concerned, we looked and looked and looked to find a girl who, well, had everything. She had to have really everything. She had to be beautiful and smart and young and, full of life. And we accidentally found Greta. She'd hardly done a thing. She'd made a little independent film, which I never saw, with some Germans, and which I don't think ever came out. And then she'd done a little bit on television, but she came for a meeting, and just really on the spot, I just decided then and there that she was the one. With SACHI, who else could there have been but SACHI? I mean, at that point, and he was exactly the right age, and
you'd worked with him before.
And we'd worked with. I'd made 3 features with him already: Shakespearewala, The Bombay Talkie, and The Householder. And we made another one later on when Ismail did In Custody. Shashi played the poet Noor in that.
I mean, your films are thought of, I think, in some ways, in a sort of limiting way as being literary with quotes around it often. But if you were to say how important you thought casting was, I mean, your films are always beautifully cast. If you were to put a number on it, on how important casting is on a percentage basis, I mean, people don't think of this. Say, oh, well, Emma Thompson and Anthony Hopkins, those are Merchant Ivory actors, but you had to find them and Greta Scacchi, I think, is a great example of someone that you seem to just know that was the right actress for that
Well,
part.
you do. I do anyway. For me, I have to have some feeling of rapport with them straight away, and otherwise it doesn't seem to work.
What was it about her? Was it appearance as much as anything, or did she have a quality?
It was a personality. Yeah, naturally her appearance, but it was just her personality. She just is completely an ebullient and lovely free spirit, and she also combined. She was a British Rose who was half Italian. What could be better? So, and she's the right age.
Yeah. The novel on which this is based, Booker-winning novel of the same name, of course, is in some ways a very cinematic novel, and that's actually no accident because Ruth Jhabvala had been working with you by then and actually said that the novel in some ways was influenced by having
been in the editing room a lot, yeah. And she sort of shuffled the scenes around for the book until she got them in the order that she thought was right. And
but she actually wrote the book, she wrote one of the sequences straight through and the other one straight through pretty much, and then began to sort of sort them out.
That.
I think I read that somewhere.
Really?
But,
It would make sense to do it that way.
And, it's said about this movie correctly, I think, that it is very faithful to the book, but there are key differences between and I wonder how much of that was a collaborative act, or how much of that was Ruth sort of rethinking for the screenplay, or how much, did you and Ismail Merchant get involved in that sort of structural
there were
aspect?
certain things which were very, very moving in the book, which we tried to include in the film, but we couldn't cast. There's the whole episode of the old woman. I think she was called Leela-ji, and the old woman who was basically, she had no money at all, and she would go around to various pilgrimages, and
then she's found dead.
and then she was eventually she died, in the novel, and the most moving scene.
It's a very moving scene, yes.
But we could not find an actress that somehow that we could do that with. It just never worked out.
But
we
you-
tried.
Yeah.
We had someone, but she was really not an experienced actress. You needed someone who really could act and had some experience. in it.
I wondered if it was because there are certain scenes, and you've done so many adaptations, if in reading a novel you say, as wonderful as this is as a piece of dramatic prose, it just simply doesn't have it just wouldn't work on screen. But you actually tried to make that scene
Well,
work. Yeah.
we did. We tried to do it, but it was we gave up on it sort of
Yeah.
midway through. We knew it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of small changes which I want to ask you that because they seem to me actually kind of significant changes. One is the scene that begins with the nude scene, which isn't in the novel per se, but then segues directly into what seems to be a dream sequence of Olivia's when she's playing the out-of-tune piano. In the novel, that seems to be a realistic scene and not a dream scene, and I wonder if you talk about how that happened, how that transformation occurred.
I don't quite place that. I mean, I remember the nude scene being she's in bed with her husband, and,
Right.
and then it goes from what's the
From
next
that
image?
into the scene of her playing the out-of-tune piano. Another way music is used interestingly, that out-of-tune piano, she's standing there with the Nawab.
Oh, right, in the palace. Gosh, I couldn't tell you how that came about now. This is
Well, well, again, 30 years ago.
30 years ago, I really don't know. And it might not have been like that. There might have been something else in between. And when we got in the editing room, we thought that was a very good sort of thing to do.
Well, it's interesting you raise that because the movie is put together so skillfully. I mean, the segues and the way that, again, music often serves as a bridge between scenes that transition from the past to the present. And how much of that was conceptually done, and how much of that did you sort of have an aha moment in the editing?
Well, as you go along shooting, things suggest themselves to you that are not in the script, and they're suggested by the place you're in. Sometimes they're suggested by a particularly talented actor that you have or actress, and you want to do more with them. All sorts of, or there's some awful hole that you have to fill with something, or something you have to hide, and so you shoot something that uses a kind of so all through the shooting of any film, there's that's
An element of improvisation, sort of on the fly.
It's
Yeah.
improvisation, and a lot of it happens because of really where you are and where you're working. Many things, you can sit in a room in New York and write a script, or a room somewhere else and write a script, but when you get on the set, those things sometimes are just not possible to do, and you need a whole other thing, and you have to find it and make the script work.
Zakir, let me ask you what it was like, as a first-timer to be directed by James Ivory. What do you remember about the ways in which he was eliciting and drawing a performance out of you?
I did not feel pressured. He had a very subtle way of helping you out, just nudging you along. Just twice, I think, through the whole shoot that we had, when he told me, okay, try to use a prop, maybe bite your nail or something, something like that. Or at one point, we were in the palace and shooting a scene, and then I think he noticed that I was struggling because there was a lot of lines to speak and stuff, and he just sort of stood next to me and spoke the lines, and that was it. He didn't say do it this way or that way. He just spoke the line and said, and just looked at me, and it seemed such a natural thing. Suddenly it was very clear to me that, I'm trying to act the lines. I'm supposed to just say it like a normal person is supposed to be speaking it, and just figure that out as to how to say how are you, as opposed to how are you. So and those are the 2 points, 2 times when he actually just suggested something, and that was it. Not like make me do it 50 times or anything like
Well,
that.
I was going to ask that one thing people always say about going on a film set is you cannot believe how much waiting around there is, and takes and retakes and retakes.
Well, there is. That's always true. Yeah.
Maybe Wilder did that.
All right. Would you, is that a fair characterization of you as a director, do you think? Do you tend to be a sort of a less interventionist director than some, do you think? Or in terms of directing actors, I mean, getting the kind of performance
Well,
you're looking
you know,
for.
it's every film and every character in every film is a different situation, depending on so many things. I really don't believe in telling the actor how to do things, and I think actors are well, I've always had the idea that actors are narrow but deep, whereas directors are wide but shallow. And usually the actor has so carefully examined the character, the part, and thought it out, and they've created something already, and they bring that out. And unless they're really far off and really wrong, they bring something out which is usually pretty wonderful, and it's a gift, and it's their work, and they're artists, and they're there to give you their art, and you'd be an idiot if you were saying to them all the time, no, don't do that, don't do that, no.
Stress on the third word rather than the fourth, huh?
Yeah. I think people have to be allowed, and this is true not only of the actors, but it's generally true of all the different people who work in the film and contribute something that's actually seen on the screen.
Set designers, lighting.
You have to allow them to do their work, and if something happens that you really don't like, that you think is wrong, or you just don't happen to like it, then you work on them, and you bring them around to something else, and that too happens.
Because you're often doing period pieces, which is to say things set in times other than our own, do you encourage actors to do research, or is that something that they tend to do?
They just do it anyway. I mean, they do too much, in fact, sometimes. And what they do, I mean, you created a script from a book, and chances are they'll go out as soon as possible and buy a paperback of that book, and they'll know it by heart practically. And then they come on the set and, well, what about this scene? This scene is not in the script. I think this whole scene that you left out that was in the book really defines my character more strongly than anything else. And
don't read the book, read the script, huh?
so, and I've worked on certain films in which the actresses, more than the actors were going around all day long holding the paperback like people look into cell phones. You know, like this all day long.
That's fascinating. Did that happen in this case, with this book?
No, not in this case.
Yeah. Well, is there another case where you had to shoot sort of two films and then fuse them together this way, where you shot sort of these different time sequences and literally were shooting sequentially two different, although connected films?
Well, none of this was sequential. Mm-hmm. I mean,
no, I mean having shot the contemporary story.
I don't think so. Mm-hmm. No, I think this is the only film we've ever made where there are two stories, and taking place in two different periods. Yeah. There might have been flashbacks and things of that kind, right, but there have never been two whole stories with two completely different casts. You
had said once that this was the hardest film you ever made, and then I think in a subsequent interview you said, well, maybe not. I wonder how you feel about that. Now, I know you had difficulty getting the movie financed. Maybe that's what you were referring to.
Well, that was one of the problems with this film. It was difficult to get it financed. We pretty much shot the film, but then we ran out of money and we couldn't go on with it. And, they go to the next stage of editing and all of that, and post-production. And it was tough on Ismail, but he managed eventually.
Managed to pull together. And it was also, I think at that time, one of your most successful films, although not so much in the U.S. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about what happened about that.
Well, apart from Slumdog Millionaire, I don't think there's ever been a successful Indian film in this country. There always has been, even the Ray films, marvelous as they are finally, well, they're subtitled and for a somewhat limited audience, you could say, of people who like to go to subtitled movies. And there's a further thing that people have had an idea about India that maybe it's going to be, they're going to see images they don't want to see. There'll be things in it that, you know, something that may be suggesting poverty or something unpleasant and all this sort of thing. And, or if not that, then some other kind of thing that's just not their interest. And so, you know, whatever Indian film it is, they don't ever seem to play to a very, very big audience. And this film, which was, well, actually Universal Pictures was distributing it, and there was an executive there who was very, very excited about Universal acquiring the rights to Heat and Dust and bringing it out and all. He was really, really young executive, really excellent. And so we sold it to him and to Universal. And then, lo and behold, at the point when the film was ready to come out, that guy left Universal to become a producer and put it in the laps of some other people who had no interest in it.
Who had no
really.
investment in it, literally. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it
They had
was
money.
a Universal picture, but it wasn't one that cost very much. And there wasn't a lot of money riding on it. And so they didn't really push it as they might have. And really because and this is something that happens all the time in the movie business. Someone takes you up, you do something, and then that person is gone. And then what you've done people who inherit it, as it were, don't want to be identified with it if, God forbid, it's not a success. So they're a little standoffish. They don't want to be tainted. If the thing bombs, they don't want to have their name attached to it. And this happens all the time.
The movie did well in England and other markets, but it was kind of...
Wonderfully well in Europe, and particularly in England, of course. Yeah, it was a big success in Europe.
And how was the film received in India?
You know, I mean, it wasn't really. No.
You have thoughts about why that would be?
You describe it.
I remember Ismail talking about something like 50 nights or something of showing in India, and for him that was a breakthrough in terms of film. But when you compare it to films that do become a success in India, mainly Bollywood films or Hollywood mega action thriller films, it wasn't in that mold at all, and it wasn't the kind of film that the normal ticket-buying people in India go to see. And so in that sense, it wasn't a big success, but in the kind of clique where people were interested in movies which challenged them, and the kind of people who went to see a Mrinal Sen film or people like that, for them the film was a very special film, and it still is. In India, people still talk about Heat and Dust, and I'm shocked that when I'm doing interviews in India, they still ask me questions about, how was it woodworking in Heat and Dust and so on and stuff. And in the industry, it had gained a lot of respect, the film, amongst the directors and producers of Indian films.
Was there anything about the content of the film that would have been dissonant or perhaps that would have been received differently by an Indian audience, say, than an American or a European audience, do you think? Anything about the film itself, the content of the film, any aspects of it that would have...
Well, for me, it is, I guess, important to go out there and do what you feel you want to do, as opposed to wanting to make a successful film or successful recording or whatever it is. And that's one of that is the stamp of James Ivory or Ivory Merchant Films, is to be able to make the film they want to make. And in that sense, the film is a success. It's something you stand behind and say, this is what I wanted to do, and and it's exactly what it is. So you don't, I don't see that film with the idea, oh, we could have changed that, or we could have done this, or maybe have one of those film kind of a song from Bollywood that might have brought the audiences in. It was not required. It wasn't needed. The statement as appearing there for you was complete. And so I don't see that was necessary.
Well, one artistic choice, James, that I think is interesting is that there's a fair amount of dialogue in Hindi that remains in Hindi and is untranslated. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, and I mean, we kind of know from context what's being said, but...
Well, I think it's pretty much everything that is, I mean, plot-wise, I think you learn everything you need to learn. I mean, there's nothing that's, anybody says that's, we don't know finally what's happening. I mean, it's, and I think, well, I think that's the way, I've always, when I've made films where people have to speak, there are certain scenes where people really need to speak in their own language. And I just let them. I mean, I prefer to do that. And then sometimes we have to put subtitles. If it has a real bearing on the plot, we have to put subtitles, and we do. But I don't think there was anything here when they were speaking in Urdu or Hindi that needed that so much. You've got the idea, I think.
Yeah, and it lends a real sense, for me at least, of really being in that place. I mean, it really lends a sense of texture to the movie also, which I'm sure...
I think language and the sound of the right language is such an enhancement to the mood of it and what you're trying to create.
It's a kind of music in a way, and it's of its own
exactly.
kind of verbal language.
I've always felt that.
Yeah. We want to include you all in this, so if you have a question, if you would raise your hand, and we're going to have, I think Deborah has a microphone. I guess we need to borrow one of these. We're short on microphones. So if you have a question, we'd like to get you involved in, but we'll keep chatting up here, and there's one here.
Hello, I'm just curious, what do you personally consider to be your greatest achievement cinematically to date, for whatever reason? What you're most proud of when you look back on your career?
What I'm most proud of?
Yes, when you look back on your career.
I think of the years in India as being the heroic years, if you want to call it that. I do really feel that. Meaning the first 6-7 years that I worked in India. And that was because we were getting our company together, and it's not an easy thing to make it wasn't then anyway, to make a film in India. It took a lot of, well, all kinds of things. I mean, terrible things happened to us while we were making some of our films in India. For example, when we were making The Guru, the star of The Guru, Utpal Dutt, was arrested and put in prison on the first day of shooting, things like that.
That puts a damper on things.
And yeah, so all those things had to be managed, and somehow, which Ismail managed to do. But there were things of that kind, and that's why I think of it as a sort of our heroic period, or mine, or something.
Partly degree of difficulty, having to overcome so many just logistical problems.
Well, there were all those kind of things, but we were used to that. I mean, I didn't expect anything else. And when I came to work in New York, and those things didn't exist anymore. I mean, all the problems, of course, they were replaced by another group of problems, or something completely different. Which, I mean, you always have problems, and the problems lead to various, well, all sorts of things that you're not expecting, and you're not ready for financially, or there is a compromise that is forced on you that, you know, all films are full of compromises. You talk about artistic compromises, and you talk about someone, oh, that person has never compromised. If the actual making of a film, there are so many compromises that are forced on you. It has nothing to do with an artistic vision. It just has to do with the realities of the thing you're doing. So that was
Are you sometimes amused when you read something about your film, where you just, or bemused maybe, that something that you were doing on the fly is regarded as some great vaulting achievement of the film.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm sure. Were there misadventures on this film other than the finances almost going south for you?
Not really. I think we were pretty much okay. Were we
Me
not?
coming in was some sort of.
Huh?
Me coming in was an adventure, wasn't it? I mean, I mean, Nasir was.
That was a nice adventure. That wasn't.
Nasir, I think, was to do the part, and then something didn't work out, and
I think he never agreed to.
well, something happened,
Yeah, that
and
was-
then it's like 7 days before the shoot, and that's when we had dinner at my house, and, and so yeah, and then I was on a concert tour at that time in India, so there were times in the shoot where I would have played somewhere at up till 1 or 2 in the morning, and then taken an early flight at 6 a.m. to get to Hyderabad to arrive at the set to be able to shoot. So those kind of things were happening, but apart from that, it was fine. But for me, the good adventure was that you know, I got to do this, and my daughter, little one Anisa, got to be in it for a second, and the bug bit, and now she's a producer.
Zakir, you mentioned that for you it was transformative as a performer. I wonder what happened next for you after this
Oh my
film.
God! I mean, when you're an Indian classical musician, you cater to a certain you know, clientele, and those people are the ones who come to hear your concerts, and you do that, and then that's fine. So in that area, I was doing very well. I was doing just very fine, very much. But as soon as this movie thing hit the media, okay, the Prince of Tabla starring in the movie, some headline appeared somewhere, and next thing I know, you know, my concert halls were filling up. And I was being offered more money to appear in a concert. I was offered an ad, or in fact 3 or 4 other films, which I almost said yes to, but after seeing the rushes of my first 2 days of shooting, I decided I'm a better tabla player than an actor.
Hey, you never saw any rushes.
I did.
Where?
Oh,
We never had any rushes in India. We could never get them in.
Remember
That's
once-
one of the problems that you have.
See, the secrets are coming out now.
You
huh?
can't get your rushes in or
but
out.
the rushes were seen, and then at one time I told Ismail, look, if you want to replace me, that's fine with me. Because I wasn't sure if I was doing the right job, and so on and on. But it was you know, all I have, my career just like took off, and suddenly I was in public eye. I was doing tea ads, and people were, you know, watching me, and I was getting concert offers.
You didn't become a better musician, you just became a better paid musician
I
at that
became
point.
a marquee name, I guess. You know, it just. But then it was up to me to convert the audiences to through the music. And
Because you had these people who'd probably never been to a
I'd
concert.
never
of yours
been to
before.
a concert. So in that way it changed. People started asking me to do music for films, which I had never had the chance to. And people started asking me to get involved in other areas of producing and, you know, doing other things which were not really part of an Indian classical tabla player scene. And so in that sense, and then tabla player were usually considered second-class citizens in the Indian classical music thing. So suddenly that went out the window, and now, you know, I was being offered more money than people I was playing for, other musicians, and so that became a topic of discussion between musicians. but anyway, all that, I mean, and coming out to this part of the world and meeting so many different people and getting involved in other film projects and writing music for films, it just all changed. I mean, seeing composing, orchestra writing, I mean, it has finally led me to write concertos for orchestras, which are now being premiered. One premiered this year at Kennedy Center with the National Symphony Orchestra. So stuff like that, I mean, it just suddenly opened my mind to what else was possible. I mean, Shashi Kapoor is one example. Was he was taken in the householder and so on, and suddenly I mean, he was, it helped him in the Indian film world.
In the Bollywood world
Yeah,
also, yeah.
and Madhur Jaffrey, and how they all, through their connection with Ismail, and then writing cookbooks and, you know, doing other movies, or Asha Putli singing and whatnot. So there were a lot of us who really benefited from being under the
He's
shadow.
not a director, he's a kingmaker.
He probably is at least a prince maker.
I want to go back to something you said in passing there about actors looking at rushes. Do you prefer them not to do
No,
it?
I'm happy to have anybody who works on the film has the lowest of the low. I don't care. They have a right to see the rushes, I think, and they're always invited to them. The only people I don't want to have watching the rushes are the agents of the actors. Because they make trouble.
Yes.
And so they're excluded. But we could never see our rushes in India on this film, because we could not get them in time. I mean, in time to sort of benefit from seeing them. I mean, normally you see rushes, and there may be something the matter here and there, and then you redo it. Or, you know, there's a way of correcting what you've done that's wrong, or something might be out of focus, something, who knows, all kinds of things could happen. And that's the idea, one of the reasons that you see rushes is to help you do the next day's work. Well, we never had that advantage on this film, because we could never get the rushes through customs. And even getting the rushes through customs, you then have the problem of, and I remember we imported a portable projector that would play both sound and picture. We brought that from England. And even having that, we were not able to see the rushes ever. And
So did that mean that more of this film was kind of made in the editing?
No. Not really, but we were lucky. I mean,
You didn't know
there were
until
there were not too many bad things happened. And well, one thing about any lab, if they see something out of focus, they immediately tell you.
I'll tell you that part.
And
yeah.
straight away they get on the phone. But that I don't think that happened on this film
Some of
very
it
much.
did make it to Bombay, though.
Uh-huh.
Some rushes did make it to
Well,
Bombay.
later,
Yeah.
but we never were able to see anything on location.
No, well, I
You
saw
know?
it in Bombay.
That's where you saw it. Yeah, there it's easy to see rushes because you can run the picture and the sound simultaneously in a screening room in Bombay, which is, you know, the film capital of India practically, and there's no problem. But when you're out on location, it's impossible to see rushes. Or you can hire a theater and go with the picture only, as happened with us on Householder and Shakespeare-Walla. We were able to get the rushes from Bombay because those films were processed in India. So the rushes would come up and we could see them in a hired theater, but without sound, which is fatal.
Yeah,
you know.
right. Yeah, exactly.
And
Let's-
was stock hard to get in those days?
It was Kodak stock, yeah.
Yeah,
It was hard
that
to
was
get.
difficult also at the time. I mean, you had to, there was a
Well,
quote or something.
remember, and well, you weren't there. When we were shooting in Kashmir, we ran out of film. And they were shooting another film there nearby, and Shashi knew the producer, and he went to ask them if we could get 1,000 feet of Kodak from them to finish our work in Kashmir. Yeah, it was not easy to get film stock.
This film stock was difficult to obtain at that point. I mean, it was rationed in some way in India.
How much has filmmaking changed just from a technical standpoint for you over the 50 years you've made movies?
Well, it's more in the editing and the sound areas that it's changed.
In what, not to get too inside baseball here, but in what sort of crucial ways?
I mean, now, you can edit a film on a computer or a series of computers, and some of the sound is a digital thing, and it's more complex, but it's a very different thing from when you actually had film that you're handling, and it's quite different.
Oh, great. Do we have another question?
we're truly honored to have you here with us in San Francisco. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be drawn to filmmaking and to India in your filmmaking. And we believe one of those sparks was San Francisco. And we'd love to hear about how, India came to be a big part of your filmmaking endeavors.
Well, it started in San Francisco.
And
Yes, there was an art dealer in San Francisco named Raymond Lewis who dealt in old master prints and drawings and Persian miniatures and Indian miniatures. And I'd never seen an Indian miniature. But one day I went to his gallery and on Powell Street, and he had just been showing a customer all his Indian miniatures, and they were all spread out all over tables. I'd never seen art like that. I didn't know even what it was. I had no idea what anything was. But I did know that, I liked what I saw, and I thought a lot of it was beautiful, and that led to my, in time, making a film called The Sword and the Flute, of which the cameraman, Mindy Bagdon, is standing back there. So, made The Sword and the Flute in San Francisco, and that was a documentary about Indian miniature painting. I don't know if you've ever seen it, or do you know anything about that film?
yes,
Well,
yes.
anyway, that was my first, it was a film made about India, by a very sort of romantic film made about India by someone who'd never been to India. That was me. And in time, that feeling grew and grew and grew until I actually went to India to do another documentary, which was The Delhi Way, for the Asia Society of New York. They sent me. And that was a sort of a portrait of Delhi, of the city of Delhi. And then while I was making that, I then met Ismail and Ruth Jhabvala, and that led to making feature films in India. And I spent a lot of time in India in those days, and that's where our company began.
I wonder if we could back you up just a little bit. Before that, you were born here in the Bay Area, I believe in Berkeley or Albany, is that right?
But actually, Berkeley, we figured
yeah.
out, yeah.
But grew up in Klamath Falls.
Oregon, yeah.
And when did you move there? Were you a young child when you moved to Klamath Falls, or?
I was 4, 5, something like that.
So your movie going as a child was done there when there weren't video stores and things like that. Tell me.
No, but there were 7 theaters in town.
Yeah, back when there were movie theaters. What a concept.
7
right?
movie theaters, and I saw all kinds of movies and things. I love movies.
Yeah. And that happened early. Was there a kind of formative Light Goes On movie for you, or one that you particularly remember as making you think, gee, I can do that, or I want to do that?
I never thought about it in that way, but somewhere along the way I decided that I wanted to work in films, and I thought what I wanted to do, I thought, was perhaps be a set designer.
Oh,
And that's what my first idea was. And I went to film school at USC, and then somewhere along the way I thought that really what I wanted to do is be a director.
Which you started to do there. You made your first made your first movie there.
Oh.
Let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll have to bring this to a halt, as rich as it is. Everyone over here.
Thank you. I'd like to know let me rephrase this. How did you come to select the kind of stories that you chose to portray in your films?
Sometimes it's completely accidental. It might be that with the early films, they tended to be original scripts with stories that we just thought up or wanted to develop on our own. Later on, it might be just a casual thing of reading a book that I liked, and I thought that I could make it into a film. Like that. I mean, it was quite a casual thing. It wasn't, there was no sort of searching for something. Things seemed to come my way just through my reading, or would be suggested to me, say, by Ruth Jhabvala. and sometimes by Ismail. So it was never a search for material as such.
About the adaptations, which you were most well known, Janet Maslin said of your characters that they are often more broodingly eloquent on the screen than they are on the page. Does that strike true to you in some ways? Do you think of your characters on screen as having a different quality from what they were in the novels? I mean, it's a different medium, of course, and all of that, but I mean...
Well, you hope that doesn't happen on the whole.
Trying to be absolutely represent.
Well, you want to be true to the character that the writer has created, and the spirit of that character and the story, and you don't really want to go too far from it. But there have been times when something has happened that not a bad thing, but a good thing, and that a character sort of takes wing or something and grows. And
I have to ask you about another tiny little switch from this is a very small thing, but it seemed significant to me again. In the musical cushion scene in the novel, when that occurs, the Nawab wins the contest as he does in the film, but he drops down on the cushion himself in triumph and laughs in triumph. In the movie, you have him put his foot on the cushion and then he turns it over to Olivia.
yeah,
And it seems I mean, in the book, he seems more of a sort of forbidding character. It lends a sort of romance and sympathy to him in the film, and I wonder if that was, if you recall that particular switch.
We thought of him as being right. I remember that happening, and we tried various things. But we thought, or Shashi thought maybe, could be that he thought that it was more gallant if he did that. I mean, he puts his foot on it to show that, in fact, he won. But,
I mean, I think he's actually a more complex character on film because of some of those changes like that, whereas at the end, we see him gloating with joy. He'll show them now that this child is going to be born. So he really has kind of there's a kind of a more dark and light or more clearly laid out, and you're nodding. Do you kind of agree with that? Okay. Yeah.
well, that's what happens with, with an actor. I mean, an actor, you don't know what's going to show on their face, and what's, all develops slowly, and then
They bring their own values to it, and as you were saying earlier, you want that from them. You want their contribution.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
For me, actually,
please.
I have to say, it was very, very special to see that, because having grown up watching Shashi Kapoor being a song and dance man in Bollywood films, running around trees behind a girl and all that stuff and singing. And then you see him play a character where he's able to so successfully portray the dark side and still be a very gallant Nawabi kind of a guy. I mean, it was very a revelation of his acting ability, and it was like a marvel at how beautifully that came across.
Yes.
And I myself wondered that maybe that was Jim somehow cooking that into the part, but you say that it's maybe.
Well, it's hard to think, who did what exactly, and so.
It really is.
A lot comes from if you have working with a really experienced actor and someone with real sort of humor, like Shashi has, a lot is going to come from them just automatically, and
Collaborative.
That's what a
medium
performance
always,
is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's take one last question.
I was just wondering who your idols or mentors are or were, particularly in India, if you had any, like Sajat Ray or anyone.
Well, Ray was. Yeah, absolutely. And I was incredibly lucky on my first film he wasn't making a film when we made The Householder. And so I was able to have his cameraman, his entire crew, his sound man, they all came to work on The Householder. And I had never really, that wasn't something that I learned at USC Film School, about how to break down a script and how to divide a scene up into shots and so forth. And I had to learn that, actually working it out with the cameraman, who couldn't believe his eyes and ears when I said, well, I don't know, what are you talking about? He said, on the first day of work, he said, I'd like to see the shot division. And I said, what is the shot division? And so I had to learn all that from Ray's crew. And it had an effect on how I thought, and still think, I believe, how I would put something together. And I feel it sometimes in my films even now. I mean, I'm doing that because that comes straight down from Ray, via Shubrata Mitra. And so he was my mentor. We knew him pretty well, and as far as Western directors, I don't know too many directors in the West. I've seen all kinds of films, but I wouldn't say that, that anyone's particularly my mentor in the West.
James Ivory and Zakir Hussain, thank you so much for this afternoon. It's just been wonderful. And thank you.